mate, welcome to another video where today I'm going to be discussing some of the daily habits that could be ruining your spinal health, and how it's one of the things that's very often overlooked, and a really good thing to sort of look at here. This first slide, good habits, they're hard to develop but really easy to live with, whereas on the other side, the bad habits, they're really easy to develop but they're hard to live with. So it's a sort of very simple way to keep things in mind when we go through all of the stuff we're going to go through. So let's get into it. So firstly, often especially when we talk about spinal health, we're often talking about lower back pain, but it could also be talking about thoracic and especially neck problems as well. But even hip and lower limb problems, everything sort of comes from the spine, and it's usually the everyday activities, the postures, the sporting movements, anything that's repetitive is something that can create a lot of trouble, especially if it's faulty, or if it's or even if it's not faulty, even if it's just something that it's not being countered with good movement or correcting the like sports are a classic, you know, they can really create a lot of trouble if you don't have things that recognize it and counter the damage from it. So it's always the things we think nothing of that are creating all the, like I've listed here, postural deviations, weakness, and ultimately compensatory movements. And you don't see immediate problems from them, but you see them occurring over a long time and hard to change once they're there. So before I get into what these bad habits are, I think it's really important that we discuss what the safest position for the spine is. So some people believe that the spine needs to be kept really flexible and constantly stretching it and into all different things, telling you need to have a mobile and flexible back. Other people are telling you it needs to be really stiff and you need heaps of planks and stuff like that to stiffen you up all the time. Both of them are right and both of them are wrong. It's sort of like somewhere in the middle, really. It's these sort of belief systems that on either one of them that sort of lead to repetitions of things being that start to cause problems. And one of the classics is trying to flatten out the back because someone's told you that you've got an excessive anterior tilt, so your back will be protected from damage by posterior tilting and using heaps of planks or squeezing your butt all the time, and vice versa, the yoga sort of philosophy where you've got to always stretch it all the time and keep it mobile. Neither of them are really true if you're repeatedly doing it. The safest position of them all is neutral, and to give you an example of what neutral looks like, it's this very first one here. So nearly every movement that we make, if you think about it, like running, walking, even exercises like squats, lunges, deadlifts, the chin-ups, I can't think of any exercise where I'd want to adopt one of these postures here. I don't really want to adopt any of these to perform any of those movements at its optimal capacity. And even in any sport, I can't think of a person who would move well looking like any of these. Some of them, may adopt them for a period of time. Gymnastics or something might have a little bit of this extra lordosis or something, but most of the time they should be in this position. They're not actually trying to force themselves into this, and the more they can stay neutral, the better they perform and free of injury. So this is where we really need to, and you can see here the spine has to have a little bit of curvature in it. That's normal. It's when people are trying to flatten it out that everything starts to go wrong. So if we continue on this neutral position, so Stuart Mcgill, which I've referred to him many times, like he's just done so much research in all of this, he's found that the neutral is the healthiest position for the spine to function, where it's least stressed position from compressive forces and allowing it for your fluid efficient movement. So I highly suggest to read these books that he's had out to see a lot more detail on this. But he's tested this with firefighters, with elite athletes, with everyday people, and every single time they come up, it's neutral is the safest position for them to move in all movements. So you can see these are pulling, pushing, lunging, squatting, bending. This is with the firefighters, but the worst position of all was extreme flexion. And extreme flexion is often where we see the bulging discs and this is where we see in deadlifts in the gym, but in real life it's just called bending over and picking things up. You could do that picking up a pen or doing some gardening. pulling a weed out in the garden is enough to do that. So a neutral position is what you should be aiming for to achieve with most of your daily movements to build a healthy and strong spine. So it's even more important when we exercise that we do that, to reduce the forces and the compressive forces on the discs, because they're amplified if we start to move in abnormal ways. And your posture and movement strategies determine this load. The closer you are to neutral, the better you will be, and the less problems you'll have. So in addition to this is what we call shearing forces and instabilities. This is where sort of joints are slipping over each other. So this is where probably people start to feel like, okay, I need heaps of planks and stuff like that to stiffen them up. And in some ways they're right, but they're sort of missing several things which we'll talk about at the end. But shearing forces when the joints move excessively and begin to friction and rub against cartilage, other soft tissue, causing pain. This leads to joint stiffness in an attempt to protect the joint from further damage. It's often when you see SIJ discomforts and real compression there that sort of radiates down into the lower back and then into the obviously hips, and that start to stiffen up as well. Everything that should be mobile starts to become stiff. Once again, finding a way to hold the joints in neutral is the solution for this. So, but this is where you can't just sort of say, well, I just need to stiffen my abs up. You might really need to look at, I need to loosen my hips up and learn how to move better so that I move with more freedom and I don't expose things to excessive stiffness as an alternative stability. So this is contrary to what most people believe, in that the spine needs to be more flexible. And don't get me wrong, you really do need to have the ability to move your spine, as you see here, into these positions. It's not good to have a rigid spine that can't get in these. That's no good to you either. But it's the problem I have with this is using repetitive movements to do this all the time. These things, both of these here, are a great way to create a disc bulge. So you're really weakening. You're not in neutral. You're sitting in extreme flexion by doing both of these things. It's good to be able to do it, but it's not good to do it as an exercise repeatedly. So the area that would benefit from you mobilizing is the thoracic spine, which is probably maybe in this one a little bit, definitely not in this one. All right, so the thoracic spine needs mobility, and you should be sort of trying to encourage that, because that enables you to keep stability in the lumbar spine. But it's repeatedly weakening, and by stretching and mobilizing the lumbar spine that people start to encounter a lot of problems. So it's where some information is taken out of context and not used wisely. So one of the exercises I really cannot stand is the Rollup exercise in Pilates, and I've done Pilates before. I'm qualified in Pilates. I think very little of this exercise. I do not see any purpose in doing this as a repeated exercise. I think it's great to be able to do it, but not to do it repetitively. And this is, you can read through this in your own time if you want. Stuart Mcgill's philosophy on this, really sort of, I 100% agree with everything he says, and I've seen so many people come to me for help with disc bulges from doing this very thing in Pilates repeatedly. All right, so it's not a good exercise to repeatedly put the spine in this flexion like that, unless you want to give someone a disc bulge. So now we want to talk about some of the, we understand now that we need neutral spine is really important. We now need to recognize some of the habits that are leading you to fall out of neutral spine. So the most important thing you ever do for spinal health is becoming aware of what these potential problems are, and the best way to change a habit that is causing you pain is to replace it with a healthy one. Sometimes the habit itself doesn't create instant pain. This is why it might be hard to find. And a lot of people aren't aware of what these things are, because they don't feel like it's unnatural to them. They feel like it's normal. So hopefully this video might give you some areas that you can look into that may be the underlying problem for you all along. So some are hard to find, and whereas others are a little bit quicker. The ones that are sometimes they'll take a lot of time to change. Just because you know what it is doesn't mean it changes straight away, as you'll soon see. So another good quote by McGill: many back pain sufferers would experience a huge breakthrough in their recovery if only they realised that it was their flawed movement patterns that were keeping them pain sensitive. So you can see how some of these habits we're about to approach, that we're just about to discuss, are really the very thing that's keeping them in pain, but all of their treatment strategies are not even identifying, but definitely not addressing it at any point. So the first one's pretty obvious one to most people. It's slouching while sitting, and this is a simple little infographic sort of showing you, okay, I'm slouching all day, and then I sit in a car and drive home. I probably drove to work like that. Slouch all day, drive home from work. I'm looking at my phone all day. I'm stiffening up, getting sore, and then I pick up a box. It must be because I picked up the box. It was the box that did it, but really it was all of these things that did it to you. And it could be like shoulder pain or neck pain as well. So you can see how both of these are sort of leading into all types of problems with the spinal health. So sustaining slouching, forward bending, posterior spine, what it does is it overstretches and weakens the posterior fibre cartilage or annulus of the spinal disc. Over time, this just leads to poor disc integrity and displacement of the disc nucleus fluid posterior. So basically what that means, places your spinal joints and nerves under extreme pressure, which obviously ends up leading into pain. And this is, you can check out, there's a video I've done on this before, specifically just on these different postures, how much pressure in the discs from various positions. You see lying on your back, little pressure, but sitting in this slouch position is 185 kilos of intradiscal pressure from just sitting like that, and sitting with load is obviously even more. But you can see how this sitting in this position is actually worse than actually bending over like a deadlift. The deadlift is actually, the deadlift with load is a bit more, but the deadlift bending with no load is actually less than slouching. So sitting is actually worse than bending over. Slouching while walking is a good thing. If you adopt a slouching position while you're walking, you're actually still creating some problems. So again, a lot of people don't experience pain with this at the time, so they don't see any need to change it. They might have set up good ergonomic positions to avoid this. This position here is by far probably worse than that, to be honest. The laptops and stuff really create a lot of trouble. But yeah, slouching while walking is something you need to recognise. The second one I'd bring up is sleeping position. Best place to sleep is on your back for postural things. Some people find it difficult. I find it difficult to sleep on my back all night. I'll do it for some of the night, but it's just uncomfortable for some people. Maybe some people have trouble breathing that way as well. So we'll talk about side sleeping in a minute. But sleeping on your back allows your spine and muscles to lengthen and prevent problems. But you may need to have like a pillow under your leg here, and you do need to have a smaller pillow. Worst position is stomach sleeping. Never do that. But if you need to have a small pillow if you are going to sleep on your back. If you have a too big a pillow set, you'll lose a bit of curvature in your cervical spine. If it's too low, that exaggerates it. So you really do need to find a nice pillow, and you do need to, if you're not used to it, it will take a bit of time. That's what I was saying. You could address that side sleeping or is part of your problem, but it's not a quick thing to change if you're not used to it. So side sleeping, if you do like to sleep on your side, again, like the right size pillow. Some people might need to have some extra support, so something between their knees, maybe something to support their spine here on the side, or otherwise they start to create this curvature. So these are things, and again, it's uncomfortable when you're not used to it. So it's even though it's the right thing to do, there's obviously a lot of mattresses out these days that are made to do this as well, and some people find them difficult even though it's actually aligning them better. But these are things that you may need to, that could be all the secrets to what you're looking for. One problem with side sleeping is if you have a sore shoulder or a stiff shoulder, it can actually give you a lot of trouble. So that's another thing that people may need to bear in mind. So you just got to make sure that you've got like a good mattress and a good pillow. Maybe experiment with different things for a while, but you can see how this is something we're going to use for 7 to 8 hours a day. So every day, do you know what I mean? You can't avoid it. So you've got to make sure that it's in the best possible position. there's no point going in physical therapy treatments, massage, trigger point releases, all these core strengthening stuff, if you just constantly sleep in these poor positions. It's just going to undo everything you're trying to achieve. Bending poorly, I could really include every exercise really, but bending poorly is probably the most obvious one that I see with spinal problems. So, you know, poor bending actions, obviously bulging discs, but also hip problems. Sometimes occupations require you to do this all day, like I put down here, like a gardener, you know, people playing golf, but people picking up things at work. Their poor bending action, the repetitiveness of it, you know, it may not be heavy, some leaves off the ground, but it's not the weight, it's the repeated flexion like that. And again, you can see here, this is a great way to create a disc bulge. You're definitely not in neutral here. Every time you sort of keep bending your spine repeatedly like that, you're one step closer to problems. So learning how to bend correctly with using your hips is the key. This is also where we start to see, you know, like the core strength. You see, if someone's told you've got a weak core, and now you start adopting a more trunk flexion. You haven't changed this at all, and you're just doing actually more of it. You're getting closer and closer to the disc bulge. You know, so repeatedly, I don't see any value in using these at all. None. There's so many better ways to train your core, and really, it's weakness through the hips and stiffness through the hips probably as well. All right, so sports. This is where we spoke quickly about this before. Some sports, you know, the people may be really good at them, but they may encourage this trunk flexion. Do you see what I mean? Like, you can't avoid it. This is part of the sport. This is actually, you can't sort of stop this from happening, and that's fine as long as you have some training or some sort of corrective exercise that counters the damage that the sport is going to create. As over time, these things build up on you, and then you end up in these trouble where you get these herniated discs, and you may not have pain in this at the time. It's later on when you do other things that it starts to create problems. All right, so learning to approach the deadlift to the bending pattern, the Romanian deadlift is the key in the corrective fields. It's known as hip hinging, basically a huge degree of hip movement. Great quote from Gray Cook here. So deadlifting should be the first exercise taught to anyone interested in weight training because it demands good posture, promotes shoulder stability, and it forces the hips to be the driving force. This we call it the Romanian deadlift, but in the real world we just call it bending correctly. All right, so it's really, and again, it keeps the spine in neutral, and it teaches you to use the hips correctly. The next one, crossing your legs. So the problem with crossing your legs is not so much the action of crossing itself, it's the fact that people will repeatedly use the same leg to do it. Subconsciously, to develop this habit of using the same leg over and over, which leads to muscular imbalances and obviously asymmetry, and it's this asymmetry that becomes the concern, and that's what you start to see: scoliosis, lateral pelvic tilts, and all these sort of shortening on one side of the body. You know, and any time we see that, you're in a lot of trouble. So asymmetries between the left and right predictive of future injuries because they cause us to compensate, and it's for either weakness or tightness, or limited range, and eventually just everyday things, and especially once you apply compressive forces, start to create huge problems. And I've done a lot of videos on lateral pelvic tilt before. Again, see once that spine's moving out of neutral, you're in a lot of trouble. So if you are going to cross your legs, make sure you alternate. I would highly advise to try and stop doing it all the time. It just really causes the adductors to contract, while the outer hip muscles, the abductors, are being lengthened. So you're starting to sort of alter the optimal balance between stiffness and mobility, and you're starting to sort of force the body to find another way to stabilize the hip joints. So it's really the simple solution is not cross your legs at all, but if you have to, try to make sure you're even, like between left and right. Next one, 5 worst daily habits that I see problems with poor footwear. So again, I've done lots of videos on foot stability before, and our feet are meant to like shock absorbers. It's really what they're there for. So unfortunately, the shoes that a lot of us wear have sort of made our feet quite weak, So like even the runners that have been told us, they're getting bigger and bigger in the heels. Like the cushioning underneath is just incredibly high these days. They're almost becoming high heel shoes these days. They might look really good and fancy or whatever. They do really start to create lazy and weak feet, where we start to see all types of issues where we just don't absorb shock anywhere. High heels obviously terrible, might look really great, but if you're wearing them all the time, you start to create problems elsewhere. And so the chain reaction of injuries from weak feet, they basically, the feet just, because they stop to absorb shock, and basically as they can't withstand intensive forces from the ground, they stop sending fewer signals to up the chain to the ankle, the knee, the hip, and obviously it ends up into the spine. So and that's where you start to see terrible injuries like ACL injuries in the knee, but obviously spinal problems, as we spoke about before. Like as the foot collapses, the knee falls, it rotates inward, the pelvic tilt starts, you get this spinal problem, because otherwise if you stayed neutral here, you wouldn't be able to look straight ahead, you'd be uneven. So your body just alters your spine to correct its eye. It wants to always maintain eye level. It'll do anything to do it. It will sacrifice anything to find that. All right. So weak feet make it impossible for us to move optimally with efficiency. All right. So you'll have to compensate around it to overcome those problems. So in summary, maintaining good health with our spine is very important to living a pain-free life, free of limitations. We must become aware of the repetitive habits. If you're in pain right now, these little habits could be the solution that you're looking for. If you're an active sports person, these habits can be really compromise your sporting performance and obviously lead to pain. So start paying attention to the simple things that we've discussed here in this video, and your first part in changing a bad habit is recognize it. Just allow time. For some things will be easy to change, like stopping crossing your legs is a simple one, but changing a sleeping position is not an easy one. So you can see where I spoke about before, some things are easy to change, other things are really difficult. All right, but first thing is recognizing what they are, and if you do those, everything should start to come together for you quite well. If you've got questions or comments, make sure you check the description of the video. I'll chuck heaps of links of articles that give you a lot more detail in these, and some things I just quickly touch on, I'll expand upon in the articles. And if you need extra help, there's great reports and that take you through a lot of the things that I only briefly touch on here. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'll see you on our next one.